Why are your officers saluting him? He's just a neighbor with too many grocery bags." Karen's voice cracked across the cul-de-sac like the squeal of a rusty gate, shrill enough to make the Labrador down the street start barking. Neighbors poked their heads through blinds, garage doors lifted an inch like prairie dogs sniffing trouble. Flashing blue lights painted the manicured hedges in streaks of authority, and for once, they weren't here on Karen's orders, they were here for me. The patrolmen didn't just step out of their cars. They straightened, tipped their caps, and addressed me with the kind of crispness that sucked the air right out of the night. Suddenly, Karen's HOA binder looked more like a crumpled napkin than a weapon. Her son, slouched at her side, swayed like he was still trying to sweat out last night's bourbon. How did we get here? It started with the groceries. I'd pulled up to my driveway after a long shift, the kind of day that makes even the fluorescent aisles of a grocery store feel like sanctuary. I had bags of chicken, bread, cereal, and enough coffee to power a precinct. As I set them down to close the truck bed, I heard the scrape of flip-flops dragging across asphalt. Karen's son, Mike, was marching toward me. Mid-30s, face flushed, hair sticking up like he'd wrestled with his pillow and lost. He pointed at my grocery bags as though I'd stolen them from his pantry. "Share with the community," he slurred, puffing his chest. "That's what the bylaws say." I blinked at him, wondering if he really believed the HOA had authority over my breakfast cereal. "The bylaws?" I asked, one eyebrow climbing. Before I could get an answer, the front door to Karen's house slammed open. Out she came in her floral robe, clutching her HOA binder against her chest like a holy book. She scanned the scene, took in the groceries, the sun, and me. Her lips pursed into that thin, white line I'd already come to recognize as her battle stance. "Mike, step back," she barked, though her eyes stayed on me. Then she whipped out her phone and stabbed at the screen. "I'm calling the police. This is theft. This is harassment. This is a violation of community standards." Now, I'd seen Karen call emergency services for less a neighbor's dog barking. A lawn not edged to her standards. Even a basketball hoop left out overnight. But this? Accusing me of grocery theft in my own driveway? It would have been comical if she hadn't done it with such conviction. "You can't be serious," I said. "These are my groceries, bought and paid for." Karen didn't even blink. "The HOA has rules. We are a collective. You don't just bring in supplies without notifying the board. That creates inequity." Mike nodded beside her, nearly toppling over. "Yeah, inequity." I opened my mouth to laugh, then thought better of it. No need to feed the fire. Instead, I lifted a bag of frozen peas. "Pretty sure this is between me and the cashier at Safeway." That's when I heard the sirens. Faint at first, growing louder, echoing off the cookie-cutter houses lined up like dominoes. Karen's eyes lit up in smug triumph. She actually smoothed her robe and adjusted her bun, preparing to give her official statement, as if she were about to be interviewed on the evening news. The patrol cars swung into the cul-de-sac, headlights cutting across lawns, tires crunching over asphalt. Doors opened, boots hit the ground, radios crackled, and then silence. "Commander." The first officer nodded at me. The second gave a crisp salute. A third tilted his head slightly, waiting for me to give direction. You could have heard a pine needle drop. Karen's triumphant grin slid right off her face. Her binder wobbled in her grip. Mike muttered something that sounded like, "Wade, what?" I cleared my throat, not loudly, just enough for the sound to carry. "Evening, officers. Just unloading groceries. No emergency here." The senior officer glanced at Karen, then at me. "We got a call about theft?" His tone was skeptical, already tired. Karen stepped forward, gripping her binder like it could shield her. "Yes, this man was hoarding supplies, against community standards. I demand you take action." The officer's gaze flicked back to me, searching my face for confirmation. I gave the faintest shake of my head. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "Commander isn't hoarding anything. He's in his own driveway." Karen froze. "Commander," she repeated, her voice cracking on the second syllable. The officers shifted, their postures formal, deferential. The salutes, the "yes, sir" responses, it was all unmistakable, and every neighbor peeking through their blinds saw it. The entire illusion Karen had built over years of barking orders, stapling violation notices to mailboxes, and lecturing people about her community collapsed in an instant. I picked up a bag of groceries, deliberately slow, and walked toward the house. "Gentlemen, thank you. I'll handle things from here." The officers nodded, climbing back into their cars. Engines rumbled to life, but Karen wasn't done. Her voice wobbled, shrill and desperate. "Wait, you can't just, he can't be." She flipped her binder open, shuffling pages, desperate for an ordinance, a clause, anything that might reassert her power. Her son tugged at her sleeve, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear. "Mom, he's the police." That's when Karen snapped the binder shut and glared at me, eyes gleaming like she'd just discovered a fresh battlefield. "Fine. If the law won't protect this neighborhood, then the HOA will." And in that moment, under the flashing lights fading down the street, I knew she wasn't backing down. Not tonight, not ever. This was only the beginning. "According to this charter," I said, holding up the real bylaws, "the only person violating community standards tonight is you, Madam President." The room went dead silent. Karen's gavel, still clutched in her fist, hovered midair like she was debating whether to strike me or the table. Her son, Mike, muttered something about fake documents under his breath, but even he didn't sound convinced. A few neighbors coughed, chairs squeaked, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, filling the void Karen's authority used to occupy. For the first time, I wasn't just another homeowner in her firing line. I was the one turning the spotlight directly on her. It hadn't even been 24 hours since the grocery incident, and already Karen was staging an emergency HOA meeting. Flyers had been taped to mailboxes overnight, printed in bold red font as if the neighborhood were under attack. The subject line read, "Violation of community harmony. Urgent response required." I could practically hear her dictating it, bathrobe tied tight, barking at her printer at 2 a.m. By the time I walked into the clubhouse that evening, the room was already packed. Folding chairs scraped against linoleum, neighbors whispered behind paper cups of weak coffee, and the faint smell of air freshener tried and failed to cover up the mildew in the corners. Karen sat at the front like a queen on a throne, floral robe replaced with a stiff blazer 2 sizes too small. Beside her, Mike slouched, scrolling through his phone with the smugness of someone who thought his mother's word was law. Karen pounded the gavel against the plastic table so hard the sound cracked through the room. "This meeting will come to order. We are here to address a blatant violation of community standards perpetrated by—" She paused for dramatic effect, then pointed the gavel at me. "Our so-called police commander." A few neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Others tried not to look at me at all. Karen thrived on that kind of tension, feeding off the awkward silence like it gave her superpowers. She lifted a stack of papers and waved them around. "First violation, unauthorized bulk groceries. Second violation, improper use of driveway for unloading commercial quantities. Third violation, intimidation of HOA officials through misuse of law enforcement connections." Her words landed with a thud of absurdity, but she delivered them with such theatrical confidence that for a second I think she almost convinced herself. Mike leaned forward, muttering, "Yeah, misuse. Total abuse of power." I leaned back in my chair, studying the faces around the room. Mrs. Patterson, 2 doors down, avoided Karen's eyes and stared at her lap. The Hendersons whispered behind their hands. Even Tom, the HOA treasurer, looked like he'd swallowed something sour. Finally, I stood. "Madam President, may I?" Karen gave me a tight smile. "Briefly." I walked to the front of the room, the click of my shoes echoing off the linoleum. Every eye followed me, some curious, some nervous, all waiting to see if I'd make a fool of myself or of Karen. I set down a thick folder on the table with a solid thump. "These," I said, opening it, "are the actual HOA bylaws. The same ones filed with the county clerk. The same ones every homeowner signed when moving in. And nowhere—" I flipped through the pages, letting the paper slap against the table for emphasis. "Does it mention groceries, driveways, or the number of frozen pizzas a man can unload from his truck?" A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Stifled, nervous, but laughter all the same. Karen's jaw tightened. I continued, sliding a few highlighted pages across the table toward Tom the treasurer. "But you know what it does mention? Transparency and rule changes. Any amendment requires a board vote and homeowner approval, which, according to these records, hasn't happened in over 3 years. Tom's eyebrows shot up as he scanned the highlighted sections. He glanced at Karen, then back at me, his mouth opening like he wanted to ask a question but thought better of it. Karen snatched the papers from the table, waving them in the air like they were forgeries. "These are outdated. I've updated the rules myself to reflect the needs of the community." "Without a vote?" I asked. Her silence was answer enough. The room shifted again, neighbors leaning forward, whispering, some finally daring to look her in the eye. Mrs. Patterson's voice cracked through the tension. "Karen, is that why I got fined for planting tulips? Because you rewrote the landscaping section?" Karen banged the gavel so hard the head nearly flew off. "Order! This is my meeting, and I will not be interrogated." I placed my hands on the table, leaning just enough to meet her glare head-on. "It stopped being your meeting the moment you rewrote the rules to protect your family. Shall I read the section about board member accountability?" The air in the clubhouse grew heavy, thick with the smell of burnt coffee and the weight of Karen's unraveling authority. Mike muttered something like, "This is a setup," but even he sounded unsure now. Karen's face flushed crimson, her gavel trembling in her hand. For a moment I thought she might actually storm out, but then she straightened her blazer, eyes narrowing into slits. "If you think you can turn this community against me, Commander, you're mistaken. You might control the police, but you don't control the HOA." And just like that, she slammed the gavel down with finality. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow, as if daring me to strike back. And in that silence, I realized this wasn't just about groceries anymore. Karen had declared war. "By the authority of state statute, your presidency is terminated effective immediately." Karen's scream cut across the cul-de-sac, shrill enough to rattle the wind chimes on 3 different porches. Blue and red lights spun across the manicured lawns, turning the hedges into a kaleidoscope of authority. Her son, Mike, stumbled back, suddenly sober as the realization sank in. The neighbors who'd gathered at their driveways didn't gasp this time. They exhaled relief, maybe even gratitude that someone had finally called her bluff. If you'd asked me a week ago whether grocery bags could topple an HOA president, I would have laughed. But here we were, binder pages fluttering in the evening breeze like the shredded remains of her kingdom. Karen wasn't losing power because of groceries. She was losing it because the truth had caught up with her, and the law had finally walked onto her perfectly edged lawn. The investigation hadn't started with me. It had been brewing quietly, buried in the county's audit reports and whispered complaints from neighbors who were too afraid to speak up. My first clue came after Chapter 2's little emergency meeting. I'd gone home that night, pulled out the official charter, and compared it to Karen's so-called updated rules. What struck me wasn't just the fake clauses about groceries or basketball hoops, it was the financial section. The numbers didn't add up. HOA dues collected over the last 2 years were significantly higher than what had been reported in the public minutes. And tucked into the small print was a line item that reeked of fraud: consulting and administrative expenses. I'd seen this game before. Different names, same scam. Money redirected to shell accounts while the community was left with broken streetlights and potholes big enough to swallow a bicycle. I didn't have to dig alone. The state's Department of Consumer Protection already had a file on Karen's HOA, thanks to a trail of complaints from homeowners who'd been slapped with outrageous fines. All I had to do was hand them the missing puzzle pieces, and when you're a police commander, people return your calls very quickly. By the time the state's investigators arrived, the neighborhood was restless. Letters had gone out announcing yet another mandatory HOA gathering. But this time, Karen wasn't the one who got to hold the gavel. The meeting was staged right in the cul-de-sac, under the glow of street lamps and the flash of patrol lights. Neighbors pulled out lawn chairs and clutched mugs of tea like they were settling in for the final act of a soap opera. Karen marched to the center, binder in hand, blazer stretched to its limits, her son trailing behind like a sulking shadow. "This is harassment," she shrieked before anyone had even spoken. "A coordinated witch hunt. The commander has manipulated you, all twisted the rules, turned law enforcement against the community." I waited until the noise died down, then stepped forward with a single manila folder. No theatrics, no binder, just facts. "Madam President," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "this isn't my investigation. This is the state's. They've reviewed your books, your so-called bylaw revisions, and your spending reports. And what they found doesn't look like community service. It looks like fraud." The folder opened, and the evidence spoke louder than I ever could. Photocopies of bank statements, HOA dues, rerouted into an account under Karen's maiden name, thousands in consulting fees, paid to Mike for work he never did. Gasps rippled through the cul-de-sac. The Hendersons actually clutched each other's hands. Mrs. Patterson whispered, "I knew it," like she'd been waiting years for confirmation. Mike staggered back, his face pale. "Mom, you said it was legal." Karen slapped the binder shut. "Don't you dare turn on me, Michael. This is fabricated. Lies. All of it." But no one was listening anymore. The spell was broken. I raised the final sheet of paper, the one that would end her reign. According to State Statute 421.7, any HOA president found guilty of misappropriating funds or altering bylaws without due process is automatically removed from office, effective immediately. The words hung in the night air, heavier than sirens, heavier than her binder. Karen let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a snarl. "You can't do this. This is my neighborhood. These are my rules." I looked around at the neighbors, the same people she'd fined for leaving trash cans out an extra hour, the same family she'd humiliated at meetings, and I asked, "Are they?" The silence that followed was more powerful than applause. One by one, garage doors opened wider. Neighbors stepped forward, not timid this time, but bold, standing shoulder to shoulder. Karen wasn't the center anymore. She was just one person, clutching a binder no one respected. The state investigators approached her then, calm and professional, explaining her rights, her options, the upcoming audits. Mike tried to tug her away, but she dug in her heels, shrieking about conspiracies and vendettas until her voice cracked. That's when the real shift happened, not in paperwork or police lights, but in the collective sigh of a community finally unburdened. People whispered relief, even laughed quietly, the kind of laughter that comes when a storm finally breaks. I thought that would be the end. But as Karen was led back toward her house, binder clutched like a life raft, she turned over her shoulder and locked eyes with me. Her voice, hoarse but sharp, carried across the lawn. "This isn't over, Commander. Not by a long shot." And the way she said it, the conviction, the venom, I knew she wasn't bluffing. Karen might have lost her title, but she wasn't about to surrender her war.